Hi there, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada, and you're listening to An Intelligent Look at Terrorism, which, surprise, surprise, is a podcast about all things terrorism related. The last couple of months have been an interesting one in Canada and in many parts of the Western world. We're seeing a lot more attention being paid to a phenomenon that gets called right-wing terrorism or right-wing extremism, sometimes called the far right as well. Rather nebulous term that includes an awful lot of things. Not something that I worked on when I worked in security intelligence, but clearly there are a lot of concerns now in a lot of parts of the world that actors who subscribe to a variety of ideologies called the far right are posing a problem. And the question then becomes, what do we do about it from a societal perspective? And perhaps more narrowly for my purposes, from a security intelligence and law enforcement perspective. I thought that in order to get a really good handle on the phenomenon here in Canada, I want to bring in somebody who knows one hell of a lot more about this than I do. And so I'm delighted to bring onto the podcast today Dr. Barbara Perry, who is with the Ontario Tech University, the author of a recent book on the far right in Canada. And she's going to elucidate and enlighten us as to what this all means. So, Barb, thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me on, Phil. Looking forward to this.
Okay, let's start with the easy questions then. What in God's name how did you get started looking at right-wing extremism writ large in Canada? What was it that launched you on that pathway?
I don't even know. Well, when I was teaching in Arizona at Northern Arizona University in the when was that? Late 90s, early 2000s. I started looking at white supremacy then because, in that context, Arizona was one of the states where there was a lot of militia activity, a lot of white supremacist activity. So I did dabble in it a little bit as an extension of my broader interest in hate crime and hate studies generally. In the Canadian context, I think really what got me interested was my frustration with this obsessive focus on Islamist-inspired extremism to the exclusion of all other forms of extremism in the West generally, I think, and certainly in Canada. So there was a call for papers under the Konishka Project, call for proposals under the Konishka Project at Public Safety I want to say that was probably 2011 or so that we applied. And so I applied for that grant, never expecting that it would be funded, but lo and behold, it was, and very excited about the potential. It was interesting because the opening conference for that round of Kanishkas, right-wing extremism was probably mentioned 2 or 3 times only in introductory comments from the Minister of Public Safety and others. But what was really interesting was that the one panel on right-wing extremism was one of the most highly populated, if you will. We had a really large crowd, so it suggested there was some interest. So it was ironic that we published that first report in 2015, just as things were beginning to really come to the fore in North America with the lead up to the Trump election and his campaign.
It's interesting that you came at this sort of from the hate crime perspective. And just as an aside for my listeners who aren't familiar with the Konishka Project, this was a decision by the Canadian government in the aftermath of the Air inquiry. That was a royal commission that looked at the tragic terrorist attack in 1985, actually the largest single attack in history prior to 9/11, in which over 300 Canadians died. They were killed by Sikh extremists. And one of the findings of the inquiry, rather one of the recommendations, is learn more about extremism. So the Konishka Project, Konishka was the actual name of the aircraft, was founded. I don't disagree with you, Barb. I certainly, in my time at CSIS, which was from 2001 to 2015, right-wing extremism really played a very distant second fiddle. In fact, I'd say it played like an eighth fiddle to the problem of Islamist extremism, in part because we were running like crazy trying to keep track of all the jihadis running around the Toronto 18, et cetera, et cetera. Let me ask you a definitional question, because this is something I really struggle with. When we talk about right-wing extremism, what exactly does that mean? I mean, how far encompassing, how narrowly focused is that? Can you give us an idea as to how you define that term?
Yeah, it is a troubling one. It's a really slippery movement, and I say movement in air quotes there, because it is very loose and it morphs very quickly. I mean, as we're seeing, in the last 4 or 5 years, the changes in the movement in terms of what the focus is, in terms of the demographics, all of those pieces have changed really dramatically. It's really, it's a real challenge, I think, even for us working in the area to come to any kind of consensus on a definition. So I think that uh, what we've really focused on is, that it is a loose movement that tends to be characterized by extreme and exclusive narratives around nationalism. And nationalism defined not just by race, but also by ethnicity and gender, as well, is often included in there as well. So, and you talked earlier on about, sort of the multiple elements of the movement, and that is certainly the case. We're sort of seeing it in terms of pillars, and there's different ways to look at it. I mean, one of the graphics that we often use is, a series of circles, and there are anti-Muslim groups, and there are traditional neo-Nazi or racist skinhead groups.
And they
There
all
are
overlap at one
the
point or
alt-right.
another.
They absolutely do. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one way to think about it. Another way is just to think about the columns, or perhaps the targets, if you will. That there are some groups that are, predominantly anti-Muslim, but there are some where there's overlap around anti-Semitism and
Hmm.
anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment. There are pillars, if you will, that are, what we refer to as the manosphere, the misogynistic elements. There are anti-authority elements in the movement as well, as there are in the left. So it's interesting that there are
Mm.
areas where there's overlap between left and right. But I think, sort of currently, I think one of the uniting threads really is this notion of nationalism, and the nation, as a white European, white Euro um, state, and not just nation state, but, also the broader notion of nation as being, pan European, we'll
Mhm.
say, to include all of those white settler identities.
Which would explain in many ways why they're virulently anti-immigrant, because they see these people as usurpers of what they see as the primordial, or the perhaps the best example of a nation state. Then.
Yeah, absolutely. That it sullies those racial definitions and those racial identities that they have used to define, what it is to be Canadian, if you will.
So let me push back a little bit. I don't disagree with you that a lot of these groups have a very odd sense of nationalism and how they define it. One could argue that what's happening in India right now under the Modi government and the BJP part and the RSS, extreme Hindu nationalism, very anti-Muslim, very anti-Christian. I wrote a whole chapter on this in my last book about Hindu extremism and other forms of religious extremism. So would that qualify as kind of far right extremism too? And then what do you do about, I don't know, other countries where you have sort of equal notions of exclusive nationalism? How does this all fit into the same kind of descriptive area?
Yeah, well, there are regional, obviously. I mean, even domestically, there are regional differentiations in terms of, what that looks like, and there are certainly, global distinctions and commonalities. I would say, in terms of what the far right looks like, and so I think those forms of nationalism would also be included under that broader rubric, right? It's a reactionary
Mm.
claim to return us to what we once were, right? Assuming that, everything was rosy and so much better and so much safer,
Oh, the past is
physically and
always
culturally.
rosy,
Yes,
Barb. That's the way people
absolutely.
see it, right?
Yes.
I like the use of the term reactionary. I think that's a really good descriptive term. And in fact, in that sense, the Islamist extremists also fancy this imaginary seventh century society where everything was nirvana and the Muslims ruled the roost and all that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
want
that's what extremism is about, right? Is creating a social order in one's image, or, one's ideal image, and, whether that's a new one or whether that's, harking back to olden days. That's, I think, one of the things that often distinguishes perhaps left from right, nationalists from anti-nationalists.
And this is why they're so exclusionary, is that they basically put up a fence or whatever, a tent around themselves. Nobody else is welcome in then.
Yeah, yeah. As my Scottish immigrant father-in-law, former father-in-law, would say with his great Scottish brogue, "Send them all home." Oh, you mean those immigrants? Yeah.
Let's turn our attention more specifically to Canada, Barb. You wrote a book with Ryan Scrivens back in 2019 entitled Right-Wing Extremism in Canada. Great title, very descriptive on what it stood for. And my understanding is that Ryan was a student of yours. He's since moved on to University of Michigan, I believe, as a professor. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, he was. He was my undergrad student and my master's student and my research assistant at the time, and now he's my colleague on the updated project. He's at Michigan State, actually.
You
Yeah,
gotta love when
yeah.
that
Oh,
happens,
don't
right?
make that mistake. Yeah.
But you gotta love when that happens, when a student you've had for many years goes on to his own success in his own right.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So excited for him. Yeah, he's landed in his dream job. It was really where he wanted to be. So really, really happy for him.
Oh,
And
that's
we continue to collaborate, but he's found his network very nicely.
Oh, that's good. I like Ryan as well. So maybe you could walk through for my listeners, Barb, what you and Ryan found in your book and what you found in your research since that time. When we talk about right-wing extremism, taking into account the nebulosity, if I can use that term, the definition, who are the main actors here in Canada? And perhaps if you can, how does that compare with the main actors south of the border, where I would argue, and I'm pretty sure you would agree, their problem, their issue with their far right is orders of magnitude worse than it is here in Canada. So how do the two countries compare? Starting first with Canada.
Yeah, I think it's proportionate in many ways. In 2015, when we published the report on which the book was based, we identified just over 100, 120 active groups in the Canadian context, and
120
we've been
active groups in Canada?
yeah, and that was pretty conservative estimate then, because really, given that it was only the two of us, we were really focusing on Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, a little bit in BC. But we're estimating far far higher numbers than that. In the magnitude of 300 or more active groups, and it's a moving target because there's a lot of morphing, schisms created between groups, and new ones popping up and old ones disappearing. So it's sort of really hard to get a finger on it. But there are a lot of groups that persist. After 2016, um, Blood and Honor, which was the first far right
Yes,
group to be designated
listed.
as a
Yeah.
terrorist entity. Yeah. They're in spite of that, they're still active, especially in Western Canada. Who else? We have Pegida, which is an acronym drawn from the original German group,
Hmm.
which is Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. They're increasing numbers in terms of chapters and adherents since 2016. So we've got those old groups that are regrouping and creating new chapters, but we're also seeing a lot of completely new groups that have emerged post 2016. So Soldiers of Odin, Proud
Hmm.
Boys, for example,
Which,
being
which is Finnish in origin, I believe.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the interesting things, that a lot of the movement here, a lot of the groups here are offshoots of either European or American. We have a lot of our own homegrown. Don't get me wrong, but we do have some offshoots. So the Basin Atomwaffen, for example, which are amongst the most violent American
Mm-hmm.
groups, we also are seeing evidence of them in the Canadian context. Patrick Matthews,
Mm-hmm. Right.
of infamy, who was a serving member of the CAF,
Right.
who when he was about to be outed, ran off to the States and was subsequently arrested there on sort of not terrorism charges but related charges.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are really strong connections between Canadian groups and individuals and their counterparts elsewhere. I think one of the other things, though, is we've focused for so long on how many groups and where are they, that sort of thing. one of the things that we're seeing now, and hearing about in our interviews with law enforcement and intelligence communities in particular, and community-based organizations, is that there is a real atomization of the movement.
Mm,
So we've got these groups, but we've also got a lot of floaters
mm,
out there who don't necessarily affiliate with any particular group, but sort of flow in and out of the social media forums, for example, associated with some of these groups. So those are, what we have been calling in the past lone actors,
mhm,
who have been the most dangerous and
mhm,
damaging. Right? I mean, the mass homicides that we've seen in Canada have all been attributable to individuals who have been mobilized by their online engagement, and often engagement in one direction. Right? They're not necessarily posting, but they are consuming
mhm.
these sorts of vilifying narratives online.
Such as Alexandre Bissonnette when he went to the mosque in Quebec City in January 2017. You
Yep,
would qualify
absolutely.
him as one of these lone actor sort of floaters that simply absorbed information from online, and then eventually that it spurred him on to act.
Yeah, absolutely. And Justine Bork before him, who killed Justin Bork rather, who killed three
Mm,
RCMP officers in Moncton, and after Bissonnette, Alex Manassian, who killed 10 people in the streets of Toronto with a
mm.
van. So he was
I'm
motivated by that misogynistic, column, if you will, as affiliating with the incel movement.
I'm really glad you raised the incel movement, Barb. It's something that I struggle with defining it as terrorism per se, because I personally don't see it as ideological. I see it as hate. I see it as misogynist. Would you put the very small number of violent incels? Would you include them in this grand scheme of far right extremism?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the sort of the longevity and the through line of misogyny and patriarchy that runs through the far right. It always has. One of the ways to preserve white supremacy is to preserve the white race, as the 14 words suggest, right?
Yes, right.
That we must what is it? Must defend the future, protect the future, and whatever it is.
Yeah.
I can never remember the 14 words. But anyway, it really is about preserving the purity of the white European bloodline, and so women are to be, well, they would put it in terms of are to be protected and coddled and
Hmm.
cosseted,
Of course.
or oppressed, as the case may be. So there is that through line of and sometimes it does go to the extreme of misogyny, but certainly of the need to control our women, and it also implies that unfettered right of access to white women in order to breed and perpetuate the white race.
Hmm. You've made the case, obviously, that with perhaps several hundred groups, however groups are defined, and a bunch of floaters out there, that it obviously is a serious problem here in Canada. It's one that's developed rapidly. I mean, I would argue, we looked at the far right in Canada in the 1990s, and we
Mm.
we had them so fully infiltrated by human sources they didn't do anything, and they kind of just gave up, and they all went back to the States. That obviously has changed now. So is it your opinion that as of 2020, the latter half of 2020, is the Canadian government now taking this threat seriously enough?
Well, I think they've begun to, and we started to see glimmerings of that when Goodell was still the Minister of Public Safety, where he was very public in his condemnation of the far right and very public in the recognition that the far right was an increasing risk to Canadian national security as well as public safety. So I think that was really the beginning of a trajectory of greater acknowledgement of the problem. So for example, the latest CSIS report included, paid some attention
Mhm.
to ideologically motivated violent extremism, in which they included
Right.
ethno-nationalist and religiously motivated and gender motivated. So that recognition. My fear is that what may be happening is, that we lose the specificity of right wing violence. So or right wing extremism, and that seems to be what is happening in some quarters. But
So sorry, what do you mean by
nonetheless,
lose the specificity? I can't even say that. What do you mean by that?
Well, what someone just in the last week or so in one of the interviews sort of framed it in these terms that it's about looking at the targets of the violence, and so if it's motivated by Islamophobia, and it is extremist violence, then
Ah.
that's the issue. So what that does is that it shatters the notion that there is something bigger than an individual or a particular group, that's focused on Muslims. It loses, I think, the links, the connections, the threads that bind all of these elements together. These very diverse elements that
Mhm.
I talked about that nonetheless, are united by nationalism. So that worries me a little bit, and it also then allows them to equate left wing and right wing extremism as equally um, challenging.
Let me throw out obviously a controversial point there. You raised Ralph Goodale, who used to be the public safety minister before he lost his seat in the last election. He, of course, was under the Trudeau Liberal government. He made a big deal about the threat from the far right. The previous government, under Stephen Harper, of course, was a conservative government, and they didn't seem to make as much a big deal of the far right. Um, Putting you on in an awkward position, Barb, do you think that there was a political element to this at the same time?
Well, there always is. I think this is an inherently political area. But I think there were, not to give too much credit, but there were some pragmatic reasons for, paying less attention, during the early 2000s, late 1990s. After the Heritage Front, in particular, sort of disappeared, as you mentioned earlier on. There wasn't a lot of really highly visible, organized activity. There were a lot of incidents. We identified, between 1985 and 2014, about 120 incidents, I think, of right wing uh, inspired extremist violence, as opposed to about 8 incidents of Islamist inspired
Mm-hmm.
extremism. Yeah, I mean that's the numbers are still suggest a different priority than what we saw at the level of the government. But yeah, it was a relatively quiet movement. It was very not very well connected, I think, across the country. So we had these little pockets that were acting individually, and nobody was putting together the big picture. So I think that our report went some way to make sort of drawing that bigger picture for the government. But also, I mean, to be honest, after 2015, we have seen a really dramatic increase that you would have to be willfully blind not to acknowledge that there is a growing threat and an increased threat associated with the far right. So yeah, I mean, it is absolutely, I think, a political issue, and especially now, again, when we're pitting left versus right, and that has been very much politicized by all quarters. The conservatives and liberals and NDP and Greens even.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it is. I think there's no way to separate conversations of extremism from political nuance.
So let's keep it in the political realm for a little bit longer, Barb. You mentioned 2015, which of course coincides with the election of you know who, not Lord Voldemort, someone south of the
You should not be
border.
named. Yes, yes.
uh, Coincidence that we've seen a
Not
marked
at all.
spike in the far right and a president who, at a minimum, seems to be nudge, nudge, wink, wink towards these groups. And then who knows what he actually thinks because it's really hard to tell. Is there a link there?
Oh, absolutely. It is no coincidence. We are subject to the same social media feeds. The same sound bites as our colleagues, counterparts to the south of us, and we are all, I think, informed by and shaped by the kinds of really hateful narratives that have come out of first the mouth of a presidential candidate, then a president elect, then a president. And he has not backed off on that. And I'm really very concerned about, the next election.
Hmm. I think we all
Not
are.
that far away now, right? Yeah, because it's already, been polarizing. It will continue to be so. And especially in the context of COVID, you add that in, and he's, exploited that, the Chinese flu, Wuhan
Hmm.
flu, Kung flu, he's called it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just am really fearful of patterns that we're going to see associated with the far right. And win or lose, I think it's going to give, sort of fresh fuel to the movement, because if he wins, it sort of reinforces and reaffirms his positioning. If he loses, then, the right, and he is going to claim, and the right will support him in this, the far right, that it was, the election was a fraud,
Hmm.
that, the Democrats stole the election. So it does not signal well at all.
It's almost if we're a Dan if we do situation, and I couldn't agree with you more though. With with the COVID that we've had for the past 9 months or so, you've got this incredible convergence of not just the far right, but the anti-vaxxers, the people who are against
Hmm.
the economic lockdown, they're against the need for a vaccine, they're against the reality that COVID exists, and these are all seeming to be coalescing together in creating a very, very dangerous environment. Not just the
Hmm.
United States,
Hmm.
but here in Canada and the West as well, and in fact even beyond the
Hmm.
West, where it's almost like a perfect storm in many ways,
It
where
absolutely is.
all these elements are coming together. Barb, before I let you go, so you've written this book with Ryan back in 2019. If I could ask you to share with us what's on your plate right now, what are you working on right now?
Oh gosh, where to start? Well, we are on another 3-year grant updating the 2015 report. So that is another public safety grant under the Community Resilience Fund. And so that's a much larger team, not just Ryan and I, but Dr. David Hoffman in
Hmm.
University of New Brunswick as
I know him
well,
very well. Yeah.
and team members now across the country. We're also working on, and again, this is David Hoffman and myself and a team of a cast of thousands. It feels like we've also received funding from DND to a 3-year project to look at the far right in Canadian Armed Forces,
Oh wow.
which is really exciting. And as we've seen over the last few months, last couple of years, I think so
Legitimate
badly needed.
concerns that there is an
Yeah.
element therein.
Yeah, and you just saw perhaps last week, I think it was, the
Chief of
formal
Defense Staff. Yeah.
policy on, yeah, formal policy on hateful conduct
Yeah.
and engagement in hate groups specifically. So really excited to see that. That was something that we worked with DND on developing. We provided some little guidance there anyway.
So it doesn't sound like you're not going to be not busy anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. And especially if things continue as they do in the to the south of us, I will be in work for lots of time, because I continue to work on the hate crime related projects. So we've got one on anti-Semitism right now. I'm just finishing one on policing hate crime.
Hmm.
We've got one on anti-Muslim hate crime
Hmm.
as well. So what else? Oh, 2 or 3 other projects on the go. So yeah, it's definitely busy days. Sadly, it's I say it's a never good sign when my plate is this full.
Well, you're preaching to the converted here as someone who worked in security intelligence and more specifically on the Islamist extremist file with the service for 15 years. Yeah, it was never a dull day at work. I can certainly confirm that. Listen, Barb, I think we could talk for hours about this. I really do want to thank you for taking the time. Obviously, you're a very busy woman, a very busy scholar. So I do appreciate you taking the time. Just want to remind my readers that the name of the book is Far Right Extremism, Right-Wing Extremism in Canada. It was published in 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan. You're the author along with Ryan Scrivens, and I wholeheartedly suggest to my listeners that they grab a copy of this book, because it is the one, I think, the Bible, if I can use that term, of what the situation here is in Canada. So listen, thank you very, very much for taking the time to being part of the podcast.
Well, thanks, Phil. It was a great conversation. I appreciated it.
So that was my conversation with Barbara Perry from the Ontario Tech University on the far right and right-wing extremism in Canada. What do you think? Is it a huge problem? What kind of resources should you be devoted to it? You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, as well as on Twitter @BorealisSaves, or on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you want to subscribe to all the content on my website, simply go to the website, BorealisThreatandRisk.com. Hit the subscribe button. You'll get a free daily digest of all the podcasts and blogs to your inbox every morning. Love to hear from you, as well as some feedback on what you think of the podcasts and blogs. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.